What qualities make a great leader, and how can you learn those skills today?
Well, Cassie Young, a general partner at Primary Ventures in New York City, has developed her core 4. These are the 4 skills you need to build to enter the C-suite.
We're going to learn some actionable leadership skills today, folks. So let's get into it.
Kaila, we brought Cassie Young into the studio to teach us all about leadership. But before we get to her, I want to throw one idea at you. As a leader, you're expected to understand AI and translate it into actionable strategies for your team. However, it's hard to distinguish between hype and reality.
So we're here to share an AI tool that actually works, Gamma.
That's right. Gamma can turn text into sleek presentations, documents, social posts, and websites in one click.
Your team won't have to waste any more time formatting, finding images, or figuring out why that one bullet point is a weird size and just won't change. And instead, you can use that time thinking about the right strategies to deploy and how to drive actual impact for the business, all because of Gamma.
Leverage the power of AI in a way that actually moves the needle for your team with Gamma.
Try it for free today at gamma.app/PMLE. That's GAMMA.app/PMLE.
All right, now let's talk to Cassie. All right, Cassie Young, general partner at Primary Ventures. Thanks for joining us in the PMLE studio.
Thanks for having me. As I said to you, I've been a longtime fangirl of Morning Brew, so I was honored to get this invitation.
Yeah, you were sharing that you got your father-in-law hooked
I
on
got my
Morning Brew,
father-in-law
so-
very hooked on Morning Brew.
Amazing.
And he'll text me a pun in the morning, and I know it came from Morning
But-
Brew. It's always a race, but he's 3 hours behind, so it
Yeah.
always impresses me that he is up
Oh, wow.
early
Wow.
reading it.
He's
Very
got his
sharp.
alarm
Yes,
set.
yes,
That's
indeed,
great.
Indeed, yeah.
So I first heard you speak at a kind of state of the startups Primary Ventures event 6-8 months ago or so, and you presented on this idea of the core 4, which
Yes.
is these core 4 leadership traits that you needed to be a great C-suite leader, a great leader in business. And I was quite frankly blown away. Immediately, I was like, we need to get Cassie on the podcast. How do we make that happen?
Yep.
I'm glad someone was listening.
Yeah, it definitely was. And so I want to get into the 4, which are, just for our audience, P&L fluency, first team leadership mentality, pulse on Macromarket, and then bat phone relationships through strategic networking. Before we dive into the specifics of each of those, I wanted some background on how you came to understand these as important, maybe through some lessons you've had in your own career.
Absolutely. And I will say a lot of it is just right place, right time, right people. And I frequently say when you look at great leaders out there, their styles tend to be a composite of different mentors and leaders that they worked with over the course of their career. And I think my story is no different, right? And even some of the people who maybe drew the greatest inspiration for me, there may have been other things that they did that I really didn't like, right? And I kind of borrowed from column A over here and column B later. But just very quickly on my background. So, I moved to New York in 2005 and I joined a very traditional investment banking analyst program. I was a liberal arts major in undergrad, so it was a great business boot camp for me. The reason I'm sharing that is because I think it provided an amazing set of just fundamentals for how to understand businesses, right? So crash course in the financial statements and valuation and things like that. In hindsight, I hated doing that job, but I would do it again in a heartbeat, is what I
Yeah.
tell people, right? So because it really, really gave that crash course in a very compelling way. From there, I joined my first startup and I fell in love with the world of technology. And so I just had the amazing privilege in being some pretty high growth places. And so immediately after my time on Wall Street, I was at Citigroup. I joined a startup company called theladders.com here in New York as I think the 36th employee at that time. It was a very different era in the world of tech because this was a business that had raised a Series A that was like $7.5 million, which looks like seed today, right? And we grew that business, to north of 70 million in revenue without ever raising another dime of venture capital, right? So it was this amazing place where I watched that business grow to over 400 employees. I got more and more responsibility. And again, just a crash course in sort of the operating side of what went on there. But the reason I talk a little bit about my time at the Ladders is because I think Mark Sanadella, the CEO there, had this amazing way of being hyper transparent about the business metrics with the entire organization. So every Monday morning, right, this was still 5 days a week in office, right? We were there, we had a meeting that we called the Friday Forum that happened on Mondays, where we went through all of the business metrics in robust detail. So what I tell people is that we had people working in customer support who could explain why it was important to pitch certain subscription types, right? Because they understood the working capital and cash management implications of doing that. And that was sort of a lesson that I took with me of, when you educate your employees on the why of what matters, that can take you a really long way. Now, 10-15% of your employees are like, I don't care. I'm like, I'm not optimizing for those people, right? I'm optimizing for the people who are really happy to be there. So that was, sort of early operating experience for me. I had always been given the advice of go to business school. I tell people when they ask me now, would you advise going to business school? I say it really just depends on what I had for breakfast that morning, on what I will ultimately tell you. But I did choose to leave New York for 2 years to go to business school. That was another great way of just, I think, getting exposure into working with different personality types. So what I tell people is in business school, you get assigned into these curated study groups. And my study group had a healthcare administrator, a former assistant basketball coach from Villanova, an accountant, right? Someone who worked at Google. And so that just really opened my aperture where I had been in a bank and then at a startup, right? And really starting to see how different people worked. And there were very different working styles right around that table. And that was just an amazing lesson I took away from it. But long story short, I came back to New York right afterward, had the great privilege of working with some more startups during that time. The one I'll tell you about is where I was for nearly 7 years prior to coming to Primary 5.5 years ago, which was a company called Sail Through. I joined that business right around the time of the Series B. We sold that company to private equity in 2018. But I lived through this really interesting time where our founders ultimately moved on from the business, and we brought in a serial Silicon Valley CEO by the name of Neil Lustig. And Neil wound up being this amazing mentor for me because more than anyone in my life, he taught me about the importance of alignment in an organization. And he had sort of had a playbook for a number of companies that he came into around how he did drive turnaround strategy, alignment, and that was one of the best multi-year periods of my career. And we'll come into some of the stuff that we talk about in the core four. And candidly, even after we sold that business to a private equity roll-up, a number of the lessons that were inspired in my core four were things that I observed, but I had an amazing board member after the PE transaction. So Sail Through was part of this roll-up, and I took a much larger executive role across many different brands, across 10 offices around the world. And one of our board members there, this woman, Shelley Perry, who is an amazing technologist. She was the CTO of Ticketmaster once upon a time and, HP Software. She and I had a number of these just really provocative conversations where she said something that just helped me crystallize a lot of the things that I was thinking about. So that's a name, you'll hear coming up throughout the time that we talk. And so, I think it's an amalgamation of those experiences. And then what I tell people, and you probably heard this, when we talked about it at State of Startups, is that I've now had this opportunity where I've worked with a ton of leaders at every level, from executive to VPs, even rising leaders at director level. I've seen the high slope emergent talent at the individual contributor level, knowing we have people who are earlier in their careers here. At Primary, I see this in spades across our portfolio companies. We work with 100 active companies. I interview a lot of talent. And what I tell people is that, and I'm probably being generous, 90% of the people I meet and interface with are highly forgettable. And so the work that I've done around the core four is just really, with a gun to the head, if I had to explain, right, what differentiates the best in the pack, that's it. And yes, it's a framework for thinking about who are the people who excel in senior leadership. But I think there are lessons that can be carried down way earlier in the career, which is why we're just trying to democratize access to that framework so that people are thinking about it early and often.
Yeah, I mean, I love that. And I will say our audience is obviously in the 10% that are unforgettable. Yeah. And what I loved most about your answer before we get into a P&L fluency number one, I think it's a great reminder that getting exposed to as many leaders early as possible, and you don't need to become them, but there's probably something that you can take, remix, reuse from them to find a style that fits who your authentic self is, but kind of the best bits of the other great leaders you've seen. So don't try to be a copy, but you can definitely steal and borrow and remix from great leaders.
I think that's exactly right. And I would say that same thing. Like, I don't think anyone who I worked with in a past life would be like, oh, Cassie's like exactly trying to emulate this person. There's probably a 16th from this person, and an 8th from this person, or whatever it may be. So I completely agree with you. And one comment on that is I very regularly tell people when you're selecting a job, So often people select the company, and you really need to be selecting the manager, right? Who's going to be there, particularly earlier in the career, of who's going to cultivate you. One of the things I love with senior executives is when I'm talking with them for a search, I'll see things like they'll show me a slide of all the people they hired and what they're doing now. And I think that's very powerful as, okay, you are amazing at not only retaining talent, but cultivating talent, mentoring talent, and exporting talent. So if I'm a candidate, that's what I want to know. Do you know what I mean? Tell me about the people you've managed previously and what are the 3 most impressive people doing today?
Wow. It's a great question
That's crazy.
to ask.
Yeah.
All right, let's get into the core 4.
Do it.
Yep.
Yeah.
Number 1, P&L fluency.
Yeah.
What does that mean? Explain in your own words. And then
Absolutely.
we'll kind of interrogate it
Yeah,
a bit.
that sounds great. That sounds great. So P&L, profit and loss, right? More often than not, when people talk about the P&L, they mean the income statement, which is one of the 3 financial statements. I don't mean this literally that only the income statement matters. I'm talking about it from the lens of you need to have a command for the financials of your company. So since I mentioned before my amazing board member, Shelley Perry, who became a mentor to me, let me tell you the soundbite that changed my life on this. So after Sail Through sold into this roll-up, Insight was the majority owner, and they ran this amazing event in the summer of 2019 where they gathered all of the C-suite women from the global portfolio together in New York City for a 2-day workshop on how to get on more boards, right? Really great programming. Fantastic and abstract. In reality, there were like 150 women there from the global portfolio. And when they threw up the obligatory pie chart of what functions they were coming from, the vast majority were from HR. Now, that is not a knock because I say everything is a people problem. I love chief people officers more than most people on this planet, but you understand the spirit of it. Many of them weren't in P&L owning roles. When we talk about P&L owning roles, is that you are on the hook for a number in the organization. So fast forward to dinner that night, I'm sitting next to Shelley, and she says, the number one reason more women will never be in this room is because they can't walk their way through an income statement. And when she said that, I knew she meant it somewhat literally, like, do you understand what's above the line and below the line? Do you understand what gross margin is? But more importantly, I knew she meant it figuratively, right? Meaning, so often functional leaders are so focused on what's my pipeline target, right? Or how many support tickets did I resolve? Or what's my roadmap velocity? That they actually miss the bigger picture of how their work connects to the top and bottom lines of their business. So when we say P&L fluent, right, we mean that you're not talking about, optimizing for some local maximum of your function. You can come in and say, right, this is how my work connects to the top and bottom line. So one example I always love to give people is, I'm a software nerd, right? I love studying within a software company, what are the customer behaviors that make them way more likely to renew and grow? When I was at Sail Through, we had this fascinating learning. Our product was a little hard to use. Morning Brew is a customer, actually.
Yes, we are. I'm very familiar.
Okay, yes, yeah. I was on the receiving end of lots of fun calls running the customer teams there. But one of the things we observed and the data supported was that customers who had attended a live training were 30% more likely to renew. So when we had at-risk customers, we would say, we're actually going to fly them to the closest training that's there because it pays for itself in terms of the lifetime value of the contract. Why is that relevant for P&L fluency? Well, now, when I'm the customer enablement or the L&D leader, it's not like, I want more money for budget for training because it's customer net promoter score, right? Which is like, fine. But instead it's, hey, this is make the customer more likely to renew. This has a direct hit on revenue for the business, as an example.
And this really feels like something that we talk about a lot, which is like having a direct understanding of how you impact
That's right.
your business.
That's right.
And whether that's exactly I contribute X dollars to the top line, or if it's I am a cost center,
Right.
but my work enables other people to unlock revenue.
I think that's exactly right. And I think this is a really important lesson for people earlier in their careers, because another example I'll give you is, we went through this growing pain at Sail Through where our customer success managers were getting kind of frustrated with their work. These are people who were hiring out of consulting, et cetera, big brain individuals. And they're like, I feel like I'm doing support tickets, right? And sort of complaining about the work. So we said, well, let's actually do a little bit of a time tracking audit of where you're spending time. And when we did that, sure enough, we learned that they were spending 60+% of their time on support tickets, which I said was actually a financial crime to our business. Mm-hmm. It was a financial crime because support agents cost 30 to 35% less. So the wrong people doing that work. And there was a reason for it. We had, sales was ramping. We hired a bunch of CSMs and we kind of left support in the dust, right? And said, we have to go back and recalibrate. And so I think that's a great example where like your work directly impacts the margin profile of the business. So does your cost, right? And so I think understanding those decision points of like, why do companies open offices in Salt Lake City versus Soho, right? There's a reason for it. Yeah.
I'm thinking of our audience and honestly, maybe even myself earlier in my career where I was a philosophy major. I don't think I understood what P&L was until this job like 2 or 3 years ago. Like I thought it was like pizza and lunch or something.
Sure, yeah.
So I think that was always a fear of mine. Like I don't understand that. I'm scared to even like get my hands dirty a little bit because your identity is tied up in like how well you think you can understand things. What I've found though is, to your point, understanding how the business works and how your role fits into the bigger picture, even if you don't like the numbers, is extremely motivating. And I think when people get this very narrow role or they perceive it to be very narrow, what they actually need to do is to understand how their role impacts the broader business.
That's right.
That's what gets you up in the morning, excites you, and you can also articulate your value to your manager in a much more effective way. So this is incredibly important.
Right. And my favorite hack on how to nail this is take your finance friend to lunch. So I want to start like a branded campaign around this. So senior executives, I always say, take your CFO to lunch because I have a lot of friends who are CFOs. No one's inviting them to lunch. Okay. It's like they're not the most popular people in a company. But what I mean by that more tactically is, hey, could you walk me top to bottom through the P&L of our company? Where is the board riding you, right? What's keeping you up at night? And if you're earlier in your career, maybe don't ask the CFO to lunch like in a multi-100-person company, but there's going to be someone who's an FP&A manager, right? Or someone who's at more of that IC level. Go buddy up with them, right? And get their help navigating it. And I think some of the best up and coming leaders that I found, like they carve that path out for themselves to figure out, how can I tell a better story about what I'm doing?
Yeah, I think it's a hack. I mean, when you work at a great company, you're surrounded by other smart people. And I think we often feel like we need to get learnings outside of our company when, you can get them on Slack.
That's right.
You bug them enough, they'll get lunch with you and they'll teach you everything they know. So I love that tip.
And we'll be right back after this. Okay, back to the show.
I want to move on to core 4, number 2.
Let's do it.
First team leadership mentality.
Yes.
What does that mean, Cassie?
Okay. Now, I wish I could say that I invented the concept of first team. I did not. This is borrowed from Patrick Lencioni, who is a leadership coach who's written amazing books like The Advantage and 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, which I think are must-reads for emerging leaders. But the central premise of first team is that your first team, or team number 1, as he sometimes calls it, is the most senior team you sit on, right? So it's your team of peers over your functional swim lane or your direct reports. So let's go through a real example of what that means and why it matters. In a world where you're the chief marketing officer of a B2B software company, you likely have a set of direct reports that includes your head of demand gen and your head of brand. Those actually aren't your first team, which is counterintuitive for people. Your first team is the cross-functional executive team you sit on with the CFO and the CTO and the CRO, et cetera. Why that matters actually comes back to the concept of P&L, which is you put the needs of the business ahead of the needs of the function. And you understand, right, that the business can't, like your function can't be winning if the business isn't winning. So the example I always give with people on this, unfortunately, like I've seen this movie play out a few times, is you have the marketing leader who comes into the boardroom and says, we had a bang up quarter, right? So last quarter, 90% of the deals that we closed were sourced by marketing. And that's a 2x increase over where it was the quarter beforehand. But what's missing in that narrative is the fact that in the context of this broader board meeting, the company has shrunk. It's a tone-deaf comment, right? And so I regularly say, and I'm picking on marketing, but I can pick on any function here. Trust me, I'm willing to take that test. Marketing can't be crushing it if the business isn't crushing it. And it's same thing with product and eng, right? Roadmap velocity doesn't matter if there's not corresponding data in customers adopting your products, right? Or you're monetizing them. And so that's first team, right? Is really putting the needs of the business above yourself. Now, one final thing I'll say on this is so often people think about this of like, okay, well, that's just for executives. And that's untrue because there could be multiple first teams in an organization. It's just the most senior team you sit on. So let's say that I'm a chief customer officer and my direct reports are people like the head of the CSM team and the head of technical support and the head of implementation. They are my second team, but they are each other's first team. And this is a thing I see going haywire in middle management very often where there's conflict, between people who work adjacently, but not directly together. And so I think really educating people on that concept of first team and how it cascades down into the organization earlier in the career is highly beneficial.
So that was exactly my follow-up
Oh,
question.
great. Okay, yeah.
Which was like, how senior do you have to be before you can start thinking like this?
I think the second you're in a management role, you have to think about this. And I don't mean a senior management role. I think the second you're managing people, you are on a team of other managers, right? So I think that's really important. That said, I would say even when you're an individual contributor, you might not have a first team because you're on one team, right? But there are first team metrics that you must understand. So I'm done picking on marketing. Let's go over to customer support, right? I've belabored that point. Customer support, you could have the most amazing satisfaction scores on your ticket resolution, but if the churn rate of the business is through the roof, who cares? Right? So it's really understanding in the function that you're in. Again, it all goes back to P&L fluency, right? What matters? And every single work stream that you're undertaking, can you connect it back into something that is actually going to be of significance or meaning in a board meeting?
Maybe a follow-up question is, how would you go about kind of actualizing this framework as a manager, not someone in the C-suite who has direct reports? Because when I heard this, you mentioned it was counterintuitive. I kind of had this like, oh, I would never tell my direct reports that you're not my first team.
Yeah.
And I feel like the great leaders I've seen, they come into a room, you might report up to them. It feels like you are on their team. They have your back. Like they really understand what's going on with you. And I'm not saying that that's impossible based on your framework, but just like for a concrete, like tactical advice to someone who's in this situation, how can you balance both your first team being horizontal, but also keep the vertical team really excited, engaged, and feel like they're on your team?
Absolutely. So first, I think in terms of how to bring people along for this ride, I always say it boils down to two things. For me, it's education and alignment, right? Education is what we're talking about, that this concept is a thing, right? And that we all have to be thinking about it. But more importantly, I think the way you bring your team along is making sure that they understand clear as day what the first team metrics are for the company. So when I talk about like that early career experience at the ladders where we were all so fluent in the company goals, a learning from that was when I was at Sailthrough, I tell people that we had the same opening page for our monthly all hands for 5 consecutive years. And there were 3 big buckets of metrics, and they changed, but it was basically grow our business, be a trusted partner, operate predictably and financially. And there were metrics within each of them, and anyone in the company could tell you what we were optimizing toward, right? And I think that's important because then you're saying to people, listen, I'm still looking out for you. I'm growing your career, but none of our equity is going to be worth anything. Do you know what I mean? If we're not advancing the ball on what those bigger things are. The more important thing, in my opinion, is you have to make sure people's incentives are aligned. I always say, like, your team will never be fully aligned if the compensation plans are not.
Yep.
And so I always share with people this example. During my time at Sailthrough, we definitely went through some technical scaling challenges and had to go into a little bit of turnaround mode. I tell people at one point, our net promoter score was negative 26, which is worse than your cable company.
It's quite impressive, actually.
It's very impressive. Yeah, pretty proud of that. And we went on a journey to improve that, by over 50 points over a reasonably short time period. But one of the best things we did was we changed the executive bonus plans where every executive had the exact same bonus that came back to 3 metrics, right? It was our exit ARR, net promoter score, not because I think that's the best metric on the planet, but ours was in the toilet and you compete on reputation, right? And then third was a net burn target that ultimately turned into an EBITDA or a profitability target as we scaled. You haven't seen behavior change in an organization until everyone is aligned that way and it cascades down. And so I think in terms of like the brass tacks of the rallying cry, like out with the team, yes, as a leader, like that is your job, is to hire and retain great talent. But my hack as a leader was always educate people and bring them along. Like I want them to leave this job. And again, I said at the onset, 10 to 15% of people just don't care. I'm not optimizing for that set, right? Yep. I'm optimizing for the set of people who will say, gosh, even if I go do something totally different, I am way smarter and a multidimensional thinker. And so I try to position it as I'm doing this as a favor to you. So the next place that you go to, you're thinking more like a cross-functional leader.
That's great. Should we move on to the
Let's
third?
do it.
So the third is Pulse on Macromarket. Can you explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. So my headline on this, which is oversimplified, is you have to read the news, right? And it sounds so obvious.
We work at Morning
I
Group.
know,
Yeah, we're aware
You
on
guys
that.
you guys are good. Check. A+. But kidding aside, there's so much that's happening in the world, and we'll come back to like what this means in present day, because I've been talking about the importance of having a pulse on the macro market for years. Right now, there is one theme. It is AI, right? As we come into things. But what I mean more broadly by it is you have to understand the changes in the world and what they mean for your company, your customers, and your team. So I give people this example of, even when I was at SailThrough, there were all these changes in the riveting world of economic nexus and taxes, right? And where you could actually charge tax for software based on company locations. Well, I needed to understand what that was, because suddenly all of my customers were going to get a very material increase in their bill. You know what I mean? As we sort of go about that, right? Many things happening in the world of even what's happening in the student loan kind of category, right? What is that going to mean for your talent? Like, you just have to be multidimensional in how you go about things. And I've gotten the question of why. And I'm like, well, if you're an executive, you're going to be at dinner with your board. You need to be fluent, right? And have a perspective on what's going on. This has always mattered, but right now, I'm telling people, like, if this is the time where you have to adapt or you will be made irrelevant, right? And I stood up on a stage in early June to a group of 100 women C-suite executives. And I said to them, I don't know about you all. I've worked really hard over the last 20 years. It's the first time in my career that I feel legitimately old, and I refuse to be left behind. Like, I've worked way too hard to become irrelevant now, but you have to adapt. And so for AI, it means like, what isn't going to matter for your product anymore? What are your customers thinking about? What does it mean for your own business? Should you really be signing a 10-year office lease if you have no idea what the future needs of headcount are going to look like? And so that's sort of the big headline theme with macro, is just having a command and connecting it back.
I'm curious if you've seen this kind of pulse on macro market result in more innovation as well. When I'm thinking about someone who is well versed in what's going on, maybe studies even different industries than the one they're working on, looking for, the finance industry does this thing in a way I didn't expect. How could we apply that analogy across domains?
100%.
Like, do you see this more innovation from leaders that really understand this?
I absolutely do. I think it's such a great question. There are so many parallels from one industry to the next, even in terms of, in the brass tacks of like customer activation and playbooks and things like that. So I do think the really 360-degree thinkers go very far with that. I also think that it can push you to anticipate problems, right? I always give this example where last March, so March of 2024, my favorite software newsletter is Morning Brew. My favorite software newsletter is called Clouded Judgment. It comes out every Friday. And it's an analyst at Altimeter Capital who puts it out. And he put out this provocative piece that said, are we living in a conundrum of ARR, annual recurring revenue, versus ERR, experimental run rate revenue, right? And so this was, now, 16 months ago, where he said, is this real revenue that these AI companies are getting, or is everybody just trying stuff? Mm-hmm. Well, I remember reading that, and it scared the hell out of me. Like, everyone at Primary is like, enough, Cassie, with the ERR. I'm like, I don't know if this is real. I don't know what they're doing. And then a year later, it materialized. You started seeing these companies having exposés that it wasn't durable revenue, and they had raised all this money, and then they were churning. And so I think you get these leading indicators of things where you just interpret it slightly differently, and it can change your perspective or the way you work. And all of the portfolio founders I work with were like, very much done with me, right? Where they're like, we signed a contract. It's not experimental revenue. I'm like, great. Okay. I have you at least, thinking about it.
And I want to give one piece of advice to listeners, because you mentioned Clouded Judgment. And I think that there is probably more high quality independent thinkers that you have access to because of the internet, because of tools like Substack, Beehive, than ever before. And if you wait around just to get information about your job from your job, you are missing out on this like dearth of knowledge that exists from like really, really smart people who put it out for free. So I think like if you don't have a list of 5 newsletters that you're reading pretty religiously and trying to apply those lessons into your role, you're missing out, and other people are, and they're going to outcompete you. So like find those 5 and read them religiously, because to your point, you're going to hear about stuff before even your leaders at the company.
For sure. And actually, to that point, knowing that I'm such a champion of the P&L fluency, there's an amazing independent, former CFO who does a newsletter called Mostly Metrics that I think is amazing for people to get fluent on the finance side, right? So that's exactly it. There's something that's deep and independent for each of these that are amazing educational resources.
I love that. We're going to go on to number 4.
Yes.
The last, but I'm guessing not the least important. It is bat phone relationships through strategic networking. Cassie, how are people pulling out the bat phone?
Okay, so that same mentor of mine, Shelly, who had the mic drop moment around they can't walk their way through their income statement, had another line a number of years ago that really resonated with me, where she said, in a situation where all else is equal between two senior candidates, and I don't think this is specific to senior candidates, but this is what she said, the better network candidate will always get the job. And she is 100% correct. So why is that? The better network candidate has better access to customers. They have better access to talent, right? They can just get things done. And so the idea with the bat phone, right, is this is not the act of networking. That's great for I'm actually an introvert by trade. It is great news for the introvert that this is not, the quantity of your network. It is the quality, right? You have a curated set of people who call you back when you need help with something. And so the reason I've kind of worked that into the core four is because it's often an afterthought, right? And I'm just as guilty of this as the next party, right? Where you have a crazy week, you're working on a deal, whatever it is, there's a dinner you're supposed to go to, and you're like, it'd be very convenient to get out of this dinner tonight. The headline here is that you have to reorient your priority set, your value set to prioritize that strategic network just the same as you do the first three things that we talked about. And I think this is really important in an era of remote work. We work with portfolio companies that are distributed. We work with some that are in office. There's no right or wrong solution. But in general, the distributed companies that work best are with really, really experienced founders who've done that before and they know how to be deliberate. For earlier career professionals, I actually think it's horribly dangerous to be working remotely. And I think a lot of it is because of that importance of building the strategic network. I look at the people who are on my bat phone, like I've spent a lot of time with them in person over the years. And so I think that maintenance of the network is huge. At the end of the day, what is that? Networking is just doing favors for other people, right? So it's kind of like you just have to do it and know that the universe will pay you back later on. But I just think at the end of the day, this falls to the bottom barrel for people, and it absolutely cannot.
I have two questions on this.
Yes.
Well, first a comment, which is I think this also is very relevant in personal life. I think
Yes.
people talk about everyone wants a village, no one wants to be a villager.
Yeah.
And I think that if you apply that also to your work life, I think
Yeah.
you can kind of build out that network
I think that's right.
much more quickly. Second, do you think the close network is going to be more or less important as AI grows?
I think it's really important. And it's interesting. I run this community sort of off the side of my desk at Primary. We call it On the Business, like you work on the business, not in the business, for senior women executives. And we run it in New York and San Francisco. And the reason I'm talking about it with respect to your question is these are women who, after my rah-rah, you're becoming irrelevant talk, have said, well, we're going to find accountability buddies in this audience to hold each other accountable on what we're doing with AI, right? And like the number one thing they love doing now is show and tell with each other, right? There's two women who live on the Upper West Side who told me they meet up once a month for coffee to trade notes on the agents that they're building. One of them hired a 25-year-old to like coach her on no-code, low-code tools, which I think is incredible, right, that she's making that investment. And so I think right now, no one knows what's going on. Like I made this comment to my husband recently, and he looked at me like I had 50 heads, where I said, yeah, this is the most intense period of my career. And he's like, you worked on Wall Street, and your last year as an operator, you took 90 flights around the world.
Oh my God.
How is this the most intense period of your career? And I said, it's because I have no idea what's going on. Like I have no control, and everything is moving so quickly, and you will be lost if you try to figure it out on your own. So I think it's more important than ever.
Cassie, I love this last one, and I think it ties into something you said up top when it was the P&L fluency, take your finance leader out to lunch.
Yeah.
You can build a strategic network by doing that across your own business and go meet the peers, your first team.
Yeah.
And you never know where people end up. And if they're at your company and you think you're talented, they're probably quite talented as well. They're going to go somewhere else. That's someone you can make a call to in 5-10 years, and they're going to pick up because you've developed that relationship.
Yep.
The other thing I've found that I actually do is that building that network outside of your company, I think when people hear networking and they're early to mid in their career, they want to talk to C-suite people because they're like, oh my gosh, like if I could just have one coffee with the CEO, it will unlock everything I need in my. It's not true. The best people to network with, I think, are around your level.
Yes.
To your point. And so I started this like media mastermind group where I found other people that are similarly in the hierarchy as me. We meet once a month. They're all work at different businesses. They're not C-suite now. I know in 10 and 15 years, as all of our careers grow, these are people who I've developed a really strong relationship with, I trust, and they're going to have really good insights and be at a level that is relevant to where I'm at. That's actually the most important. So that would be my advice is like, you can form these groups. You don't need to over-index on talking to C-suite people.
So I think that's very well said. What I often say is like your target profile for networking is probably the next job from yours because that's where you want to go. You're also way more likely to have a hit rate and yield, right, on going after that. But I think that's right. And, you know, a lot of times I'm very big on like, what's the quid pro quo, right, of networking? You're doing favors. And a lot of people early in their career will say, well, what could I possibly offer to this VP? You can offer talent is what I always tell people. And it's funny, like I'm on a board at Duke. I do a lot of work with undergraduates and they'll say to me, well, what could I possibly do? I'm like, who are all the best CS students who are going to be looking for summer internships? Send them my way. Like literally tonight at Primary, we're hosting an intern open house. And I reached back out to any of like the juniors and seniors who've asked for my time over the last couple of years. I'm like, get the word out. And we've got great people coming tonight because of that. So everyone has a way to pay it forward. Yeah.
I love that. Well, Cassie, we're at time. I could talk to you for
I know, we could do
hours.
this for
I mean,
so much longer.
there was the insights per minute. We might have set a record here on the podcast.
I say I'm a micro machine. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Cassie Young, again, general partner at Primary Ventures. Really appreciate you talking about the Court 4 and joining us on Per My Last Email.
Thanks again for having me.
Thank you so much.
Let's roll the credits. Our producer is Michaela Heck.
Our technical director is Shoshana Waogo.
And our chief content officer is Devin Emery.
This show is a production of Morning Brew.
And get your Core 4 on, y'all.